Hi, Cara.
Hi, Vanessa. Today's topic is about stress in growing bodies. And if that
How about
sounds
stress in aging bodies?
yeah, okay. That's next week's episode. That is like a 10-hour movie. If that title sounds familiar to you, listener, it may be because you're a newsletter subscriber. So we send out a newsletter every week. We actually sometimes send out 2 newsletters a week. And we have a free version that goes to absolutely anyone who's on our list. So if you'd like to be on that list, we will tell you how to get your name on that list. But we now have, as part of our membership, a deep dive newsletter. And the idea here is that you get a really deep dive into one corner of something that impacts the life of a kid between 8 and 18, having to do with their body, their brain, their emotions, their relationships, their social dynamics. So we did an entire newsletter about stress in growing bodies, and everyone received a little 2-paragraph quick summary. And then the subscribers to our community got a much longer form, more science-rich look at what stress does during puberty and how to sort of tackle it so that our bodies and our brains and their bodies and their brains of the kids can benefit, right? So that cortisol, stress hormone levels go down and why that's important, et cetera, et cetera. So what we're going to do today is we're going to dive into a conversation about what we wrote about in the newsletter about stress in growing bodies.
And the jumping off point for us was there are times in the school year when seemingly everyone you know is stressed. So we're on calls all day, every day with educators who at this moment in time are in the final days or weeks of the school year. And that has one kind of stress. We interact with parents all the time who are trying to actually, very much like myself, this very afternoon, get to every event that their child is a part of and trying and failing to be there for everyone in all moments. So that's stressful. You have kids who, in this case, are dealing with final exams, APs, regents, who have major life milestones coming up, like graduations and proms and shipping off to places unknown, right? So there are times
or just shipping.
Cara's flexing at a term that we learned from our tech friends who are working with us on the membership, who are teaching us new words every day. So this is in recognition. We're going to talk about kids and growing bodies, but we're also going to spend some time later in the episode talking about our own stress and how our stress can affect the people around us and how learning to manage our own stress can actually help the stress of those around us.
We're not going to talk about our stress.
I don't mean
our
like mine and Cara's stress, because that would take 8 episodes. But we're going to talk about adult stress and how adult stress can impact, and adults managing stress healthfully can impact kid stress.
Well, we did promise, though, we would tell people how to become members. So before we even tee off, we'll put this link in the show notes, but you go to lessawkward.com, click on the community tab, or you could go to lessawkward.com/community, learn about the community and click become a member. Okay. So Vanessa, where shall we start?
I think I want to start actually just by recognizing, and you all have heard Lisa D'Amour on this podcast, so I'm going to do it in 2 sentences. Talk about good stress and bad stress. And we actually have a whole unit of this in our health ed curriculum because we so want kids to understand the difference between good stress and bad stress. So there is natural stress that we all feel that originated from trying to survive while chasing wild beasts to kill them so we could eat them and therefore survive to live another day. And our physiological responses to threats, to stress, to fear, to all sorts of things are derived from our origins as human beings. And Car's going to talk in a second about what literally happens in the body when we are stressed. But these days, it also means like before Cara and I get on stage, we get a little bit stressed and the adrenaline starts pumping and we get a little more energy and maybe we smile a little bit and maybe we make an impromptu joke. Or when your kid is stressed before a test, the adrenaline gets running and maybe their palms get sweaty and they also start to get super focused to sit down and take that test. So there's all sorts of stressors that help us perform and do the things we need to do in the day to day. And those are not necessarily bad stressors. Those are stressors that motivate us and get us through. So, what we will talk about after Car's explained the physiology is what are stressors that are negative and what chronic stress or negative stressors can do to our bodies and mental health.
Right. Because that list is very broad too. Right. And what is a stressor for one person might be not a stressor for another, or they might have much bigger fish to fry, and yet their bodies are responding in a similar way. Right. So here's what happens in the body. And I don't love stock photos, not going to lie, but
she obsessively does not like stock photos.
I obsessively do not like stock photos because they look very stock photo. But there are some great infographics that are available on certain stock photo sites, Pexels, Unsplash, iStock. These are the stock photo sites that I look through regularly
to find non-stock photos.
Right. Pexels and Unsplash is particularly good at that, are particularly good at that. But sometimes I'll find visualizations of what's happening inside the body that I think, if I had seen these when I was in medical school, I would have understood so much more, because they're just these really simple but elegant diagrams. So I'm going to try to describe in words a beautifully simple diagram that we put in the newsletter about what happens when the body perceives stress. So what happens is the brain releases a hormone called ACTH. And that hormone is a messenger chemical that goes to the adrenal glands. Everyone who listens to this podcast knows the adrenal glands sit on top of the kidneys. And the adrenal glands release a whole host of different hormones. We often talk about DHEA and DHEAS. We're not going to talk about those hormones today. I know, Vanessa. Shocking. We're going to talk about adrenaline and cortisol. Those are the two hormones involved in the stress response that come from the adrenal gland. And those two hormones they go out into the body and they do the following. They make the lungs, the bronchioles, airways in the lungs dilate so they're bigger so they can suck in more air and more oxygen. They increase the heart rate so the heart pounds more quickly and pushes blood around the body more quickly so that oxygen can get to the muscles and the tissues. They cause the liver to convert glycogen, which is stored sugar, into glucose, which is actively available sugar. They tell the digestive system, slow down, turn off. It's not time to be working because we have to divert energy elsewhere. And they tell the blood vessels to constrict, the smooth muscle lining of the blood vessels constrict, which increases blood pressure. And this helps with this fight or flight response. Now, there's a difference between adrenaline and cortisol. Like, I picture them like BFFs in first grade holding hands and skipping down the street, right? Because
but instead they're like tearing down the hallway at full speed. But yes.
Exactly. They're two Tasmanian devils. So adrenaline is really the fight or flight one. It's heart beating faster, blood vessels constricting, lungs opening up, right? Cortisol is regulating metabolism and sugar stores, controlling sleep-wake cycle. That's what makes you a little bit more alert. They work together, they work in concert, but they work differently in the body. So when you hear people use, and epinephrine is another word for adrenaline, or another, it's used synonymously. So when you hear people use all these words, really what they're talking about is the family of hormones that then help us run from the lion that is chasing us or manage the test that is in front of us that we have to take. It's in a moment of panic. This, cortisol is the energy supply, adrenaline is the how to use it so that you can get done what you want to get done.
So, what I appreciate about the explanation, Cara, is like it is a full body experience, right? It involves our digestive system, it involves our respiratory system, it involves our heart and our blood vessels, and it involves our brain, and it involves, and there's all sorts of physical signs on the outside of the body, right? It might be, besides a heart beating faster inside, we may have like sweaty palms or sweaty pits or, any of those things, heart racing, maybe a little bit of nausea for some
Yeah.
people,
Yeah.
right? So what's great about stress is that there's so many wonderful ways to point to all of those experiences, the embodiment of those experiences when talking to kids about stress. Like it's not an abstract concept that they somehow have to understand. Like when you're trying to describe to a kid what an ovary is, like there's 18 levels of having them understand something tiny inside their body. But with stress, it's like, yes, I know that feeling. I get that feeling. I feel that feeling.
Yeah. And I really like the word stress or stressor because that's the first domino in the line. So
Right.
you can explain to a kid, frankly, of any age, and you get more sophisticated in your explanation as they get older, but you can explain that sort of domino effect of what happens when your body feels stress. But what they have to understand about the term that is batted around all the time, it's really stressor. What's your stressor? I have a test tomorrow. That's a stressor, right? And we're going to get into all the different stressors and the buckets of them, but that's domino one. And then there is a common final pathway. Once these hormones are released in the body, the response head to toe works very similarly, certainly within a person and often from person to person.
So that's just sort of a stress response set off by any
Generic,
number,
yes.
just generic. Cara, I want to spend a minute because we're going to get into stress and growing bodies. But in order to do that, I think we have to talk about the concept of chronic stress and how chronic stress is different than an isolated event, which causes us to feel stress in the moment, but rather a sustained feeling of stress over time. And what kinds of things are considered chronic stressors and how they impact kids' bodies. I mean, they impact everybody's bodies and there are health implications for people of any age, but we're going to focus specifically on kids.
And this is something that's talked about often. It's described in different ways on different podcasts and in different newsletters and in different news outlets, but you'll recognize this will sound familiar, right? So over time, and I'm not talking the last 5 years, over big capital T time, over the last, several centuries, the things that cause humans to have worry, fear, nervousness, whatever the adjective you want to use is, those stressors have evolved and changed. And I want to start by saying there were plenty of people in the 1800s who had chronic stress, right? So chronic stress,
life or death.
Yes, I mean,
constantly.
And in many ways, and I really appreciate this. In many ways, you'll hear safety data and you'll hear public health folks say it's actually never been a safer time to be alive in many ways. And I think that's important. Like, I don't know, when we were infants, there were no car seats and almost no one wore a seatbelt. Right?
My mother-in-law is like, I don't know how my children survived. I put them in a basket on the back seat. And when I stopped short, the basket would roll off the seat.
That's exactly right. So this is not to sort of be Pollyanna about the past or anything like that. But what we know for a fact is that our bodies were designed to be stressed, to respond urgently, and in a very big and massive way. So adrenaline and cortisol, they're not like turning the volume up to 3. They're turning the volume up to 10. They're turning the volume up to 11. Okay. You are flooding the body with a hormone that is then telling all these other parts of the body to behave in ways that are not sustainable. You're not supposed to have your sugar supply, your glycogen stores converting to glucose and have high glucose levels all day long. You're not supposed to have dilated bronchioles so that you can get more oxygen in all day long, right? There's a resting state, and the resting state was really actually supposed to be the majority of the time. And then there's a stress state. And it's not, by the way, analog. There are a lot of other states. But I think it's a really important concept to realize that the stress creep that we have landed at being a chronic stress situation for many, many people, that stress creep has been climbing for a very long time. And there have been, history books written about all the reasons why so many humans over so many centuries faced chronic stress. So what are some of these stressors? And maybe you can get into it, Vanessa, with some of the chronic stressors that we call ACEs that, by the way, existed generationally. As far back as we can think, right? So do you want to get into a little of that and what, and maybe I should add before we do that, sorry, because I didn't really answer your question. When there is chronic stress and these hormones flood the body and they have consequences like increased heart rate, increased blood pressure, increased sugar in your blood, there are downstream health consequences that are very real. That's the end of that sentence. Okay.
So ACEs are adverse childhood experiences, and there's a whole bucket of them, and many of which are really quite heartbreaking, and some of which are mundane and half the population go through. So ACEs could be anything from surviving an earthquake, right? Like a physical weather event, to being the victim of abuse of some sort, sexual abuse, physical abuse, emotional abuse. They can also mean being the child of divorced parents. And as I said, half the population goes through that, but it is still considered an ACE, an adverse childhood experience. And there are issues like food insecurity, housing insecurity, living closer to violence. So it's a huge, broad category, and it is about how the world around them can impact kids in their homes, in their communities, in their schools. And many times when mental health professionals are looking at kids' risk of certain outcomes as they get older or become adults, things like looking at their risk for addiction, they will literally count up how many adverse childhood experiences that child has had and predict whether that child may be at risk for, we'll use addiction for example. Now, this is not fate. They are not writing the fate of these children, but is to help the adults caring for these kids gauge what services they need, what support they need, what care they need, so that past life experiences doesn't become destiny. They can receive what they need in order to get past these adverse childhood experiences safely.
Right. And almost everyone has at least one. Somewhere between 60 and 80% of all people have at least one. 1 out of every 6 kids has 4 or more. And that turns out to be predictive. So there's this line that we draw at 4 or more ACEs. But, as you're talking, Vanessa, I'm thinking back and I'm thinking, food insecurity is a great example. Pick any historical drama that you've ever watched, and playing out in the background is likely a story,
famine, drought,
right, about food insecurity. So I sort of wish we had these studies to compare and contrast from then to now. Of course, we don't, but what we do know is that life right now is very hard for a lot of people. And so the ACEs contribute chronic stressors to the lives of millions and millions of millions of people in this country, let alone, across the globe. It's the numbers obviously far higher and staggering. Then there are the non-ACE stressors. And this is not like a fear-mongering episode, but can you get into a little bit about what those are?
Yeah. So the sort of everyday stressors of life of kids and adults today, the 24-hour news cycle, which we are all exposed to on phones, on computers, even if your kid doesn't have their own phone, there's just constant alerts. We are in a time of great global insecurity. There's incredible strife around the world. We're about to enter a very tense presidential election in the coming months. Kids are deeply aware of climate change and how that is impacting our safety and our everyday safety. And then there's gun violence. And these are kids growing up doing lockdown drills in school as if it's just like a normal everyday thing. So those are not deemed as ACEs. Those are just the world that we live in. And that is an incomplete list.
Right. The culture of perfection, social media. I'm thinking about athletes who put tremendous pressure upon themselves to perform. I'm thinking about musicians and artists who do the same. I'm thinking about,
the insane college admissions process that kids face. Right.
Yes. Right. So, okay. So that's the doomsday painting of it all. But this is all to say that our bodies, all of our bodies, are pumping out adrenaline and cortisol at higher levels than our bodies were designed to pump out and sustain. And there's no one, I can't think of a scientist out there who would say, no, I have data to show otherwise. No, chronic stress is actually good for the body. I've never seen that study, right? Every study starts with, here are the 17 ways in which chronic stress is debilitating or causes disease or is associated with this thing. And we're going to look for an 18th.
What's hard about so many of these stressors, like people aren't choosing to live with food insecurity. People aren't choosing to live with housing insecurity. People are working hard to combat climate change. Activists are really trying to combat school violence, right? Like it's not like people are making the decision to live under these conditions, but we are in a society and a world where these are kind of thrust upon us. But we are not powerless. And that's where I want us to get, because there are things we can do big and small to help us feel empowered to deal with the stress.
And Vanessa, I want to present two different paths through. One of them being self-care and one of them being conversational, because both paths, separate and together, make a big difference here. So I don't know, you want to start with self-care?
So I spoke to a group of high schoolers, actually a group of middle schoolers and a group of high schoolers a couple weeks ago. And it was so fun, Cara. I just had the best time. And we were talking about stress. And it was in the context of mood swings and kind of reacting to parents and teachers. And I was asking them, what do you do? How do you handle your stress? Because I'm standing there thinking, I'm going to stand here and tell these kids how to manage their stress. Like they are experts in their experience. They are experts in their culture and their like mini community. And they're going to tell me how they manage their stress. And when I tell you, these kids were so phenomenal. And the ideas they came up with were so excellent. So it was everything from, the sort of what you would expect. I listened to music and some of them had special playlists like sad playlist or pissed off playlist or things like that. So they listened to music, and I think that's obviously a wonderful way. Some of them talked about going for a walk or going for a run. Some of them talked about petting their dog and how great that is. But we happen to
There's a lot of good data there.
There's a lot of good data. We'll get back to the dogs because adults, you should also be petting your dogs. Interestingly, petting your cat does not have the same release of oxytocin as petting dog. And I'm not saying that because I'm a dog person and not a cat person. But we can get back to that. So, and these kids were near the beach. So then they talked about going surfing and they talked about collecting sea glass. And they had a million and one ways to manage their stress. And it was so beautiful because all I had to do was shut my mouth and listen. And voices from all over the gymnasium were popping up with more and more interesting and creative ideas, skateboarding and knitting and on and on and on. So,
all things, parents, take note, do not happen with a cell phone in your hand. But we did not have to beat that into them. I shouldn't say
no,
we, you, Vanessa,
I
because you were
didn't
the one
have
in the
to.
gym. Like, you didn't have to say a word, right?
And some of them did say, like sometimes I'll scroll on my phone and it relaxes me. And fine, great. I mean, adults, sometimes we scroll through our phones and it relaxes us, but they had a million and one ways. And so when we think about kids and managing stress, the place to start, they were all reminded me, is to ask the kids in your life, how would you manage the stress? And if they turn around and say, I don't know, it's such an annoying question. And you say, no, seriously, like it's really important for your health. I want to talk about it. You can write it down. You can send me a text. You can go for a walk and come back and tell me whatever you want. But like, this is actually super important that we have this conversation.
That's right. So if you call it self-care, they will A, turn green and want to vomit, and B, reject it out of hand. But if you meet them where they are, acknowledge the stressors they feel, and ask them their strategies through, it's a much better packaging for them. And they tend to, maybe they don't even offer it up to you if you're in the parental role, but they will offer it up to themselves. And they all have really good strategies. And they are all open to new strategies, just maybe not from you. Right. So this is another big thing is, and I don't mean you, Vanessa, standing at the gymnasium. I mean you when you're wearing your parent hat.
When I'm a parent. And one of the school counselors who was there, I said, I'm so blown away by all these awesome ideas. And the school counselor said, we've really been working on coping skills and brainstorming and developing coping skills. And so if you have a kid who you're worried about how they're coping, one great way through is actually to reach out to their school counselor, psychologist, advisor, and ask, hey, what are you guys doing in school to help the kids? Because it might be that they actually have some great strategies and skills that they're working on in school that you could actually adopt and borrow in the family setting. So those of you who think kids, they don't care, they don't think about it, they do. They do. They're so thoughtful and they're so creative. And I'll say one more thing before we move to the next subject. Ask them if that's something you can do together.
Well, I mean, I want to say there's a reason why they feel good, by the way. And that is that when you engage an antidote to your stress, when you engage in self-care and stress reduction, right? It doesn't take away an ACE. It doesn't erase the trauma or the violence or the financial stressors or any of that. But when you provide strategies, when anyone gives themselves strategies for self-care, that translates directly into reduction in cortisol and reduction in adrenaline. And then you get all the downstream consequences that get turned on with those hormones circulating, turned down. You go to a resting state. And of course, then there's all the physiology inside the brain, what happens inside the brain with different neurochemicals. So that is why they have strategies. It actually feels good. It feels better to have these strategies. But young kids don't necessarily know what works for them or not, and they need more guidance. And, we talk all the time about how puberty is beginning earlier and earlier. Kids are feeling the flood of hormones in their brains younger and younger. And those kids in particular can feel stress. The hormone flood is a stressor, and they do sometimes need to be offered up strategies and to have things named. And again, not always by you, because wearing the parental hat doesn't always help. Before we wrap, let's do a few conversation skills because I think as important as having these wellness strategies in place is having the ability to engage in conversation with a kid who is at an 11. And of course, we know rule number one is you don't engage when they're at 11. You wait until they calm down. But Vanessa, do you want to walk through a few of the very tried and true conversational strategies that not only work, and we've seen them work, but kids tell us we love it when the adults in our lives do this?
So I started with the kids most recently and asking them, what do they hate when adults say this particular thing? And they gave me a list of things. So I'm going to share those with you, which this is an abbreviated list. They spent a long time telling me what they makes them crazy.
Imagine.
Yes. So calm down, right? We know that no one in the history of the world has ever calmed down when someone told them to calm down, and kids particularly abhor that. It's not a big deal. Right. So let's take the example of a kid is going to, I don't know, a birthday party and they're super nervous and they're not sure they want to go and they don't like their outfit. And I don't know, maybe I'll stay home. And the parent says, oh, get over it. It's not such a big deal. But the kid is like in a full sweat and their heart is racing. So not a big deal is not a helpful thing to say. So those are a couple of the ones that kids offered up of a very long list. We know that we need to get kids to breathe when they're at an 11, but I asked the kids what they would say if an adult told them to breathe. And one kid in a room of 100 kids raised their hand and said, yes, I would breathe if my adult told me to breathe. And everyone else rolled their eyes. So we know that we can co-regulate with a kid and we can take a deep breath. And as Cara said, maybe not say anything at all, but they can borrow our regulation while they're dysregulated and kind of flipping out. And we can also just empathize. We can just validate that they're feeling stressed because, as Lisa D'Amour always says, kids just need to dump their stuff on us so they can get on with the business of their day. And we are the trash receptacle, and they are dumping their stuff on us. And so sometimes receiving their stuff, their stress just sounds like, oh, that sounds really hard. I am here for you if you need me.
Right. Or that great Eliza Pressman line, do you want advice or do you just want me to listen?
Right.
And every single time I have asked my kids, and I'm not great at using that line. I should be great because it's one of the best.
We'll make you a t-shirt.
I thank you. Every single time my kids say, actually, I just want you to listen. And that is great because that is paving the path through. The other thing is we know that sleep helps reset mood and reduce stress. We know that. We know that all of these stressors that we described get better with a good night's sleep, and the stress response gets worse without a good night's sleep. I was taking a walk with a really good friend of mine the other day who was talking about the challenges of knowing how important sleep is, and her kid knows how important sleep is, but his social world is a late night social world. His friends are up late, that he is very social. He loves connecting with his friends, whether it's in person, gaming, on, social media. And she said to me, she sort of threw her arms up and she said, what am I supposed to do? Because he has friends. He is connected. He loves them. And he's not getting enough sleep. And I don't want to trade one stressor for another. If he gets great sleep and loses his connection, isn't that its own problem? And I thought it was such an important framing.
Yeah.
Because this is different for everyone, but working through with the kids in your life, how they can get more sleep while maintaining the things that protect them from all the stressors is really important. And frankly, it's really important for us too. There isn't a piece of advice we're giving in this episode that doesn't apply to us and all the stressors in our lives. And the sleep one is just as salient.
And to her conundrum, I mean, part of the way through is to help kids recognize how they feel, how they perform when they don't get enough sleep. You can tell them over and over how they're going to feel or why you want them to do a certain thing, but it's in their self-awareness and their noticing of their own mood, memory, behavior, physical well-being that they're actually convinced. And I've seen this
That's right.
happen in my own house where my kids sort of help and they need help figuring out, okay, well, what do I let go of? Or what curfews for what do I set my time on? Or how often can I actually be out on a weekend and still feel okay by Monday morning? All of those questions, they need help maybe parsing that. But building the skill of self-awareness is so great for any aspect of managing stress.
That's right.
And the thing that we didn't talk in depth about today, and we've written extensively about in the past, and our episode with Louise Greenspan covers this, is that chronic stress, researchers have seen that chronic stress can tip kids into earlier puberty.
Yep.
And it's not the cause, but it's considered a cause of why puberty is moving earlier because there are so many children living under the conditions of chronic stress. But beyond that, the mental health of a kid, whether they're in puberty or not, learning to manage stress in the body and the brain and the mental well-being requires lots of practice and lots of recognition and lots of conversation, and not demonizing it, but really empowering kids and ourselves to do a better job of getting hold of it and maybe helping them eliminate some things in their lives that are not so healthy and not so helpful in that effort.
So if you like information like this and you want it in a digestible 5 or
Not
10 minute
45-minute episode.
Exactly. Go to lessawkward.com, join our community, get our newsletter. It won't stress us out if you don't, but we would love it if you do.
Thanks, Cara.
Bye, Vanessa.
Thank you so much for listening. You can email us with questions, feedback, or episode requests at podcast@lessawkward.com.
If you want to learn more about what we do to make this whole stage of life less awkward for everyone involved, our parent membership, our school health ed curriculum, our keynote talks, and more are all at lessawkward.com.
And if you want products that make puberty so much more comfortable, visit myumla.com.